We have a special speaker for you today. Her name is Lisa Isaac McVitie. She is a Holocaust survivor. Her family and uncle fled Nazi Germany on November of 1938. Her family walked to Switzerland, and Lisa had to be carried because she was in a body cast. They crossed the Brenner Pass into Italy and eventually boarded a Japanese cruise ship that sailed to Shanghai, China. The Nazis caught up with the fleeing Jews and persuaded the Japanese to place the Jews in a ghetto where over 100,000 Chinese and Jews were imprisoned in a 1 square mile. 100,000. Lisa and her family survived World War II and were able to come to the United States in 1949 when President Truman sent the U.S. Navy to rescue the Jews that were in Shanghai. Lisa went on to join the U.S. Air Force. She married and raised a family in the United States. We are so glad to have you here speaking to us. Thank you for coming. Please come and share with us Lisa McVitie.
Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. Well, he said it just about all. But the trip, as we were leaving Germany, since we did not have any documents to leave, no country allowed any Jewish people in, including us here in the United States, unfortunately. So my father and my uncle was an artist, and he did some artistic work on some passports that my parents had, and he and my aunt had. And with those documents, we walked to the Alps, and the St. Bernard's Path is the junction between Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. And from there, a multitude of trains left at the time. I don't know if they still do, but they did at the time. And we had to be on a specific train. Now, I don't recall why. We weren't privy to that information. Children were pretty much left out of that. But we had to catch a certain train. I'm assuming here that there was a conductor on it that didn't look too close at our paperwork. And we got it to Rome. But in order to catch a passage out of Europe, we had to get to Naples. Again, I have no clue how we got from Rome to Naples. I must have been asleep or something. I don't know, but it was days anyways. And in Naples, we caught the ship, the Terukuni Maru, which is a Japanese, at the time was a Japanese enjoyment liner, one of those like we have with Disney, well, similar to that. And we were in the high seas for over 6 weeks. And that was to be the last human or humanity type life that we knew for 10 years. We arrived in Shanghai, and getting off that ship must have been the worst culture shock my mother had ever seen. My mother was so clean that she made Mr. Clean look dirty. So then to land in a port like Shanghai, the air was thick, the heat was tremendous, and the stench was unbelievable. There was no housing because China had just finished the war with Japan, the Sino-Japanese War. So most of the places that were livable at one time had been bombed out. There was rubble everywhere. And here, 20,000 Jews found their way to China, to Shanghai particularly, and to Harbin, which is another city. And in order to get away from Hitler. This place was so crowded, it's unbelievable the amount of people that can squish into one city you'd never believe. They picked us up on a flatbed truck, and they took us to a temporary shelter because there was no housing available, so they gave you a cot. And again, that was the Jewish community that had already been established over there. Shanghai and parts of China had a large Jewish community there long before the wars. The Kaduri family came from there, the Sassoon family, which you're probably more familiar with. You have the Vidal Sassoon products here. Well, they were established in China for hundreds of years. So the Japanese didn't have any problem with us being there. But when Pearl Harbor hit, Japan and Germany became allies. Hitler demanded that we all get, they annihilate all 20,000 of us. And the Japanese said, no, the Jewish community has been an asset to China, and we're not going to disturb that. Because Japan had really thought they were going to win this war. Make no mistake, they did think they were going to win this. And then they would need the international trade that these people provided. So finally they came to a meeting of the minds, and Hitler's people pointed out, well, anybody that came to China after 1937 would have to go. So we got there in 1939. Guess where we were? We were pushed into Hong Kong, which when I thought it was crowded at the pier getting off the ship, well, that was nothing compared to what Hong Kong was. We were put into a room. It was an old university building on the third floor, almost like an attic, a room about half the size of this room. There were 18 families in it. And my father, my brother, my sister, and myself, and my mother, there were 5 of us in our family at the time. But by that time, my mother was pregnant with a 4th child. So they pulled her out of the maternity ward. She just had the baby. And in those days, they kept the women 2 weeks in a hospital. And they pulled her out of that and sent her over to Hong Kong with us. And so there were 6 of us alone, and we weren't the largest family in that little area. The Japanese allowed our school system to continue, provided we were taught Japanese. So they sent over some little old lady, she was probably all of 30, from Tokyo. Her name was Mrs. Hoshino. She didn't speak anything but Japanese, and we sort of had a heyday with her. We gave her a really tough time. But that was the restriction they put on our school system, which, of course, you know, when you're not fed, when you're hungry, there was no food, very little food, no clothing. The clothes we had on our back was all we had. And the food we got a bowl of cornmeal mush. To this day, please don't offer me a cornmeal muffin. That is the only thing I will not eat, and I know it's psychological, but that's neither here nor there. This bowl of cornmeal mush, and then there was a little loaf of bread, I guess it was supposed to be, and it had more bugs in it than it had bread, but my father convinced us, eat it, because that's protein. So we had no qualms eating it. When you get hungry, you'll eat anything that doesn't eat you first. The hunger, the dysentery, the deaths, some of the cruelty, all of that goes along with the constant bombing, because by that time we were being bombed from every angle. The Allies, we could hear the flying tigers come in. If you couldn't hear them yet, you could see them, though. They were painted really bright. And the strafing in the streets, you know, they just come strafe over, and if you're in the street, you've had it. As a matter of fact, I had an earring. I had earrings one time, and I got home. I still had the loop that went through my ear, but the rest of the earring was gone. I remembered that I heard something whizzing by my ear. So it's the closest I came to getting shot at. But the constant the heat is unbearable, the humidity is unbearable over there. And like I said, disease and dysentery was just endless. I lost my younger sister there. She was just too young to sustain this, to live on cornmeal mush and a piece of bread all day. But we had Jewish teachers. It was a Jewish school I was going to. And they were persistent, even as hungry. They must have been just as hungry as we were. They didn't get any more than we did. And they still taught. They taught us to protect each other. They taught us to respect each other. And at the end of the war, I weighed 54 pounds, and I was as tall as I am now. Of course, I'm wearing 3-inch heels right now, but when I take them off, I'm just a little shorter. And my mother only weighed 53 pounds. My father, who was 6'4", weighed 92 pounds. So we were a beautiful sight, really gorgeous. Would have made Twiggy jealous. So, but the war is over, and everybody thinks, okay, good, the war is over, good, we're going to go home, right? We had no home to go to. We were definitely not going back to Germany. That was out of the question for us. My entire family had been pulled out of their home and killed. And up until about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I had no idea what happened to my grandfather. I know they dragged my grandfather. They came in the middle of the night, broke down the door. My grandparents had a German Shepherd dog. And Rolle, that was his name, he, of course, attacked. And so they shot the dog, and subsequently my grandfather, who was directly behind him, they shot him. But they took my grandmother with them. And I hunted for years to find out what did they do with her. She was 63 years old. What did they do with a little old lady that was diabetic since childhood? I couldn't find her anywhere in the concentration camps. I had no idea what happened to them. And then up until about 2 years ago, a gentleman at the Legion told me that a family member of his worked for this museum over here, the Holocaust Museum, and they wanted to talk to me. So I says, okay, we went over there, and as we were leaving, I said to the young lady, I says, I have no idea what they did with my grandmother. She says, well, do you know anything about her? I said, sure. So I gave her the birth date, her maiden name, anything she wanted. She went to the computer and found the documentation. So then the Jewish Community Center here, they have a young person come over it's part of the German program where a German, I don't know what they call that outfit, but they bring a young person in and he works for 1 year with the Jewish Community Center here. And they're not Jewish necessarily, the young people that they bring over here, but they're very, very great kids, really. I should say kids, for me they are. But the young man that was over here, his name was Paul, he worked with me on this to find where my grandfather was buried, because according to the documents that they found, my grandfather died a free man. Well, they didn't have time to fingerprint him, they shot him first. So he died a free man, so it meant that he was buried somewhere. So there are 7 Jewish cemeteries in Berlin. So this young man went hunting through these cemetery documents, and they found them for me. He was still in Germany. That was before he came over here for his 1-year tour. He went over to the gravesite, and he took a picture of my grandfather's grave. And the headstone was broken in half and just laying there. Of course, there were no survivors in the family, therefore there was nobody there to take care of the grave sites. So he and I, when he came to the States, he and I got together. We found a cemetery marker company over there, and I had him redo my grandfather's grave. And in the meantime, though, this lady at the Holocaust Museum found what happened to my grandmother. They took her from Berlin. They had her in 3 different stations in Berlin. They took her to Theresienstadt, which is in Czechoslovakia. From there, they moved her to Minsk. Minsk is in Poland, and she was in 3 or 4 different stations over there. And then from there, they took her to northern Russia, where they finally annihilated her 8 months after she was picked up. So I had them put my grandmother's name, excuse me, on my grandfather's gravestone. Okay, I'll be okay. And I felt at the time she should be on there. So I had to put all the information on that headstone, on one side for her, other side him. And on the bottom, I had him put down the word Shoah, which for those of you that don't know what it means, it tells them that she did die in a camp. In the meantime, as the war was over, my father ultimately died. He had lived long enough to produce another child. So I have a younger brother who's going to be here for Thanksgiving. But so here's my mother with 2 teenage girls and a baby in a country. God only must have forgotten about these poor people over there at the time. She didn't speak Chinese. My mother did not speak English. And there was no way out of China. No way. Couldn't get out. No country would have you. Again, we were still with the black cloud hanging over us. And I bet we stood there beating it because it rained for a long time. But anyways, finally, when the communists were coming into China, they were coming down from the north, and my mother stuck there with 3 children. She was more concerned about us girls. What happens to girls is not always very nice, you know. So my mother was truly concerned about that. And the communists were coming very fast. They were entering the city on the north when Mr. Truman, President Truman, decided this was enough. And he turned his troop ships around, empty, no troops on it, just the crew, and they fished us out of Shanghai. And the organization is an acronym of HAIS, H-A-I-S. I think you might be familiar with them. And they are still operating nowadays. They pull people out of hot spots. And they had a whole shipload full. I mean, that ship that I came over on the SS Gordon, which was a troop ship, and it was packed. There wasn't an empty cot, and if you've ever been in a troop ship, the cots were very much like the cots we had in that camp, you know. Wasn't too much difference. Only thing is they fed us phenomenally. And when we came into San Francisco Bay, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and there wasn't a soul that was under deck. They were all up on deck. Every one of us was up on deck, being welcomed into freedom. So anyways, after we got here, I had an uncle and aunt, my father's sister and her husband. They'd gotten out through Portugal during the war, and they were living in New Jersey at the time, so HAIS put us on a Pullman train to New Jersey, where we started our new life. My mother finally learned to speak a little bit of English, and we made our citizenship within 5 years, like was required. 5 years living here. I worked for RCA at the time, and when I made my citizenship, RCA had a festival going for me. Honest to goodness, the whole place was decorated in red, white, and blue, and it was just phenomenal. And I made my citizenship on the 11th of November, 1954. By the end of December, I had my right hand up, was sworn into the Air Force, and they had another party. And at the time, There were only 2,600 women in the armed forces at the time, so it was kind of unusual. And so we got an outline of what we could take along to bring into basic training. And they bought everything that was on that list. They got a hold of a recruiter and told them, what can she take along? They bought everything that was on that list. I couldn't take anything that I didn't have, that I had before, I couldn't take with me, no how. Because they only allowed you to have those things, those items. The rest was put into storage until you got out of basic training. But RCA was very kind to me over those 5 years that I worked for them. They were well advanced in something that is now almost commonplace, like if an employee wants to go to college, they adjust the hours for them. Well, they adjusted my work hours for me. And that was back in 55, from 49 to 55. Back in those years, they adjusted my working hours so that I could go to school and could continue whatever education I could afford at the time. I didn't have a sugar daddy, so going on to college was out of the question. So, anyways, I went on, I got as much education as I could find here and there. I joined the service because I felt I needed to give something back to this country. But how do you give something back to the country? You give of yourself. And that's the road I followed, and I am very grateful that organizations like this allow us to tell the story. The Nagel School over here invites me every year for Veterans Day to come and talk to the 8th graders. Now, to them, I tell the same story, but from a different angle, because our life was really a nightmare that can recur if we don't watch what we're doing. If we don't have allegiance to our country, we are going to lose all the things that we have. And just picture waking up one morning and you find that I came from a middle upper class family. We were fairly well off. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. And overnight, we wound up in a hellhole. And that can happen again if we allow it. So we as Americans must stand together and say, that's enough.
That's right.
Like Germany, you know, people that were your best friend yesterday were not allowed to talk to you because you had to wear a yellow star, right? So you were evil. So you were ostracized everywhere you went. And these are things that kids nowadays cannot even imagine. So like I say, I do tell them the story of my journey, but I also tell it in a little more detail. Thank you very much for inviting me and tolerating me.